Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning, Lisa.
How you doing?
I'm good this morning, but apart from our chat previous to pressing record, I'm stable. Stable as
Ex-
stable can be.
Excellent. Well, it's so good to have you join me this morning on my Trauma Recovery and Resilience YouTube channel. And really, I like to kick straight in because we've got 20 minutes. Let's kind of really go for it. First things of all, how did we met? How have our paths crossed?
We actually met virtually, which is becoming a pretty much a standard for the way that I am meeting people nowadays, on Twitter. And I think because both of us have an interest in trauma, and then we actually met face to face, or what they call IRL, at the Trauma Congress. That was our first actual face to face meeting, I think. And I think we are on most social media channels and kind of see each other's work on there as well.
Brilliant. Yes. And tell people, what is it that you do? Why might I have invited you on today?
Okay, so I am a child and in brackets adult, because I work with adults as well, but mainly child trauma psychotherapist. I happen to have a practice that's specifically for trauma, so I see children who have been sexually abused, children from domestic violence, children who are having new traumas, and this is the other side of my kind of work and business, and what I'm now doing research-wise is I'm seeing more and more children in practice with issues from internet and cyberspace. So what I coined as cyber trauma about 8 years ago, and I'm currently doing a PhD around it, and I'm currently writing books and blogging and podcasting, and essentially that's probably why we're going to be speaking. I'm taking a good guess.
Brilliant. And can I just ask, what led you into doing that and coming up with the phrase cyber trauma? What happened for you to do that?
Well, in short, I will keep it succinct, Lisa, for you. I am a geek, and by that I mean I am a gamer. My background is engineering, computers, gaming, and I decided to train as a psychotherapist about 10, 11 years ago. And actually what I did do was said, right, I'm going to leave the digital world because it kind of saps your soul. And here I am 12 years later, sitting with a psychology degree, sitting with this training. And actually what I have noticed is this digital world has just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I came up with the phrase cyber trauma from a UKCP conference I did in 2012. And I was actually looking at peer-to-peer online grooming and abuse. And I kept happening upon lots and lots of images, lots and lots of videos. And I kind of had conversations with children at the time that I was teaching. And I started to say, okay, so what happens when you watch this? And lo and behold, the world of trauma that I was beginning to learn about and the world of digital kind of synthesized. And I used this phrase cyber trauma and said to people, when you are in cyberspace, you have to be aware that we've gone from a place where we had choice and autonomy to now where things actually come at you, and it's just as traumatizing as it is in real life.
That's really alarming, isn't it? I mean, when you put it like that, and you think about it, and you think about how the struggle that parents have in keeping their children safe, that foster carers have, that parents have, that schools have, that youths, anyone who's involved with children and young people. And I'm guessing, but I would imagine that it's a little bit like the drugs world, where it's really difficult to keep on top, keep up with new names, new drugs, how they're being mixed up. I would imagine it's the same online, that there are new platforms, new things coming up. How on earth are, in that context, parents, foster carers, grandparents, school,
Everyone.
how are those people, in your experience, are those people able to safeguard children and young people?
Well, in short, this is really conveniently timed. About 3 days ago, we are on Thursday, yeah, so Monday, there was a paper released by the government, mainly the Children's Commissioner, and her policymakers. And this white paper has been brought out to make it a statutory law that social media companies are accountable for some of the behaviours and some of the material that ends up online. However, one of the issues we've got with this white paper is, I'm going to say essentially, it's not just down to social media companies. So to answer your question, how do we keep on top of this? I don't know. It is such a big world. It's almost like saying, how do we stay on top of safeguarding children, period? Because and I'm going to try and use a metaphor here, what children are managing is their real world in terms of within their head, about their attachments and people that they're connected to in real life. And then they have this bigger virtual world, and that virtual space they're also holding within their head. So they're almost managing two versions of a world that we as adults use in singular entity. Does that make sense? Because I'm aware that's going a little bit kind of academic, but
No, I think it makes absolute sense, and it's one of the things that generationally is really quite difficult to grasp. So
yes.
We might think we understand social media as parents. We might think we understand, we're on Facebook and we put these pictures up. But that one of the things that I've become very aware of is how managed my social media is, what adverts I see, what people I choose to watch, what echo chamber I might decide to hang out in. And children and young people are not discerning in that way. So they don't create those safer spaces. So already, not only do they have a world that it can just be done to them, as you say, having had been around social media and that world their entire life, if they're 15 or above, 16 or above, that's going to impact very much on their internal world. That, I can't even imagine it. It's generationally outside of my experience.
It is, to use the phrase, mind-blowing. So when I'm teaching, particularly when I sit with therapists and I say, okay, here's all of the theories that we understand about the corporeal world, and this is what we know about people. Well, now take that world and make it forever. Because in the corporeal world, we have issues such as when somebody dies, that's it, it's done, it's forever. However, if you now look at what's happening in cyberspace, you will have anniversary reminders, people's social media profiles are still present, children are struggling within my practice. I see a lot of younger age children struggling to understand the concept of permanence. So I'm working with a young girl who has said something like, well, won't Nana respawn? No, that's not how it really works, because there is a permanence to the living body. And we're almost getting into, I think Douglas Rushkoff talks about this, we're moving away from being able to be in a real world. We are living in a virtual world. And I think what's really difficult is trying to understand what it is that young people have to manage on a daily basis in terms of relationships, in terms of conversations that are never finished. So I'll give you an example from a podcast I did with a couple of young ladies, and we talked about Snapchat. We were actually talking about how Snapchat's used rather than what people think it's used for. And these young ladies will get up in the morning, they'll have 30, 40 conversations that are still ongoing from the night before. New ones will begin that day. They will go to school with all of these conversations sitting in their head still. And then when they come home, they then retake up those conversations, and based on where somebody is in the world, they're then taking on new time zone conversations. It's really is something that I think what the difference is when we were at school, Lisa, we left the school gates and literally what happened on the bus was after school, and then that was pretty much it. And you took it back up at 9 o'clock in the morning afterwards. Whereas that doesn't happen for young people now. So there is this huge amount of what they feel is pressure, what they feel is never being able to switch off. And for me, that concept really, really does kind of blow my mind. And sitting with the younger people, I have to try and get my head around this and then try to explain that to adults. And as we're doing now, it's probably going to be sitting with people saying, I don't understand this, this is too much, it's too big. Well, give that to a 15-year-old who isn't fully matured in terms of brain development and architecture, and that's what they're having to manage. You know, it really is a huge concept.
And I think that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to talk to you, because, you know, we've got to be talking about this in the mainstream. Because I know that when I've done training with foster carers, for example, and actually even sometimes teachers, there is this kind of, oh, I don't know about that. Oh, I don't understand that. And I'm kind of the view that we have to really try and understand it. If we're working with children, we have to somehow get our heads round the unthinkable, in terms of being it, because if we can do that, then maybe we can offer some alternatives, some different ways of how we protect children. I mean, let's just talk about that in the context of safeguarding for a minute. And you know, the media has been full of child sexual exploitation, county lines, radicalisation, gangs, etc. And all of that, there is a space for all of that in the cyber world, isn't there? When it unites with somebody looking for a sense of belonging, when those two things collide, then we have this huge challenge and difficulty, don't we?
Yeah, to be honest, that's the conversation. That is a conversation I've had all week. I was recording a podcast earlier on this week, and that's one of the things we talked about, is that a children's sense of identity and the them and us actually begins in the corporeal world. Well, when you have the option to, if you think exponentially, think about the number of identities that you may not have been exposed to, just in terms of geographical location, in terms of, you know, who was in your village, that now has become. So, for example, if I talk about gender transitioning or music tastes, I was limited by the kind of people that I knew at school. So if one person knew about punk and one person knew about alternative, I might be privy to being open to those kinds of music because they might play, they might talk about them. Whereas now I can go online, go to Spotify, and literally just search and search and search for what's trend, you know, go through the trending and through the algorithms, and I'm going to get a higher rate of exposure to things I would not necessarily have come across. And in terms of safeguarding, that's the principle that I kind of give to people. So last week I was actually teaching foster carers, and somebody said, oh, well, what I do is I click on all the adverts and I take them off. And I said, but you're still buying into the filter bubble. Now, this filter bubble principle is pretty much what you talked about earlier. We are railroaded into seeing particular news items, adverts. So if you were to Google, say you were looking for a health clinic, I think about what young people do. So if you were looking for a health clinic, the Google results that you would get would be entirely different to the Google results I would get. And it's not necessarily based on geography, it's based on what I've searched before in Google. So it's almost tailored to the individual and the algorithms. And then if you imagine that what a young person does is they go on their smartphone, they will have been searching for things to do with science, to do with homework, to do with maths, to do with philosophy, to do with pop trends. And this is where it's actually uniquely individual and it's uniquely fed. So the algorithms and the filter bubble become very individual to that person. And they are aimed around data, selling, data mining. It's all about what we can get out of these young people for later on in life. So the safeguarding that we've got to think about is not just traumatic issues that you and I would be familiar with. We've now got to think about what is the potential for this and what's the meaning behind this as they progress through their life. Because in 10 years' time, what they're privy to is going to be very, very unique. And each person will then be at risk of unique safeguarding issues, which, you know, in terms of what we're trying to do as adults and protect these children, really does make me a little bit scared.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking while you were talking, you know, that we could not have envisaged where we're at 10 years ago.
No.
We had no idea. Would you say that that's the same again? That if we think about where we're going to be in 10 years, that actually it's the same, we literally, and in fact, even 5 years, if we think about how speedily this has grown.
Yeah, well, my geekery leads me to spend a lot of time looking at exponential technologies and where we are heading. I use a lot of VR because I'm really interested in where we're going with this, and the things that are called haptic feedback, so body morph suits that you will wear. And I was actually saying to my uni supervisor the other week, I go, yeah, oh, so I almost get excited about the way technology is going. And then it's slanted straight away with, and here's what you might then be seeing in your therapy room. So I have this double bind all of the time, and it's, you know, it's very polemic. I can't get excited about something myself because I see the potential for misuse. And, you know, the way that we are now creating technology. So I don't know how many of your viewers are going to be aware of. On Star Trek, there was a room that you could go in, and it was called the holodeck. And the holodeck was essentially a place where people could transport themselves into another world. So I'm doing that in inverted quotes. And all of the sensory, somatic feedback would actually be as if you were on that world. Well, we're literally 5 years away from that.
Wow. Yeah.
There's already a prototype in place saying that within 2 years it will be almost 50% complete. So within 5 years, and this is to do with, so there's lots of things called Moore's law, which is, so it's like a checkerboard or a chessboard. If you put one piece of rice on the first square, the second square you would have 2, the third square you'd have 4, 8, 16. So pretty much like binary. By the 64th square at the top of the chessboard, you wouldn't be able to put enough rice. It would take more than Britain to actually have that amount of rice at the end. And that is how quickly technology is moving.
Yeah. I mean, if you could, you know, give any kind of top tips, if you like, of what's happening, what the impact is, you know, latest news, things hot off the press. I mean, what would you like to leave people with to think about?
We can help and manage some of this with the young people, as long as we have open conversations and dialogue channels. So it's all about communication. So when I'm working with parents in therapy, I will be saying, go and ask about the game, go and sit and play the game with the child, use your ability to be curious to find out exactly what it is that the child's doing, and your mind is going to be opened to, you know, what this world is all about. B, critically think about what you read in the news. So, you know, I'm going to go with, I adore Prince Harry in terms of being a person, but what he said last week about Fortnite being addictive and more addictive than cocaine is absolute rubbish. The research data just does not prove or say otherwise. And the reason I can say that is because I'm looking at a lot of the research that's coming out of the Oxford Internet Institute, where, you know, there's professors. It's a well-regulated institute, and a piece of research that came out not so long ago has highlighted that lots of the news articles that say social media has a negative impact on mental health is just not true. The data just does not show that, and it was skewed by a particular researcher in America to say, look, iPhones are making children unhappy, and that isn't actually the case. You know, have a look at the research around gaming disorder, because again, the research does not support these issues. So whilst we have conversations in the playground, this is how I'm going to tailor it. We have conversations with other adults, and we will use layman's tales or old wives' tales, and we'll say things like, well, my son won't get off the computer, therefore he must be addicted. And actually we're using psychopathological language in everyday terms, and they mean very different things.
I'm going to stop you there, because that is really interesting to me, because the problem is that's very nuanced and people can't hear that. So when they hear research that says social media has no impact upon mental health, and you're saying it has no impact, that's what people hear. So then people put social media in one big box. It's almost like there's no way that there is not a harm occurring. We've talked already about how that's used around safeguarding, how that, you know, there are concerns and challenges around overuse, unguided use of social media, but the headlines don't nuance it in any way, do they? So can you nuance that just for us as well?
Okay. So my conversations would be so when we have words like addiction, overuse, excessive use, they're not very well defined. And this is a conversation I keep having with people. Quantitative research tends to use, and I'm going to try not to sound like an academic here, so they tend to use laissez-faire language. They'll say, so it's overuse. And actually that needs a very clear definition. What does that actually mean? So for me, it's individualistic. So for one child, if they are using let's go with Fortnite because it's the popular game at the moment. But if a child does not want to leave Fortnite, there needs to be a question about why. What is happening and what is going on? So one of the metaphors I use is the spaghetti test. We all know how long it takes to cook spaghetti, but when I ask that question, I will always get different answers back based on whether somebody wants it al dente, whether somebody wants it soggy, whether somebody's cooking brown spaghetti, white spaghetti, whole wheat spaghetti. So it's all about having a conversation with the young person. And what I do find is it can be an escape method for some children. It can be a coping method for others, but actually it's pretty similar to playing a game of cricket or rugby. They are engaged in an activity which has an outcome that they are invested in. So when parents say, right, turn it off now, there is a conversation to be had about where's the next save point, where are you at, how long has this campaign got? So in Fortnite there's pretty much a standard campaign and it's about 45 minutes. And parents haven't understood this fully. And what they say is, right, you have to turn it off at, 38 minutes. That has a devastating impact in terms of what then happens to that child in the playground the following day, if by any faint chance they've got their microphone on and the parent comes in and says, right, that's it, Henry, turn it off. And then there's a bit of a debate and the parent turns it off. Quite often I'm dealing with young people who say, and then in the playground the following day I was teased because my mum turned it off. So it's about understanding what the young person's engaged in, why they're engaged in it, and why it is they feel they can't leave. So another podcast episode, we talked about young people who have become mini therapists. So what they're actually doing is managing somebody else's suicide ideation on the other side of the planet at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I've heard this so many times. Yeah.
And without some kind of parental intervention to actually say, you don't have to do this. Yes. But I think that's such a valid piece of advice for people around, it's very practical and not something I'd have thought about at all. I mean, my kids are 20 and 22, so those kind of issues were really at the very beginning of gaming and all of those things. I mean, we were still in the realms of listening to Harry Potter on a cassette,
Yeah.
So very different kind of era, but just even knowing that Fortnite has 45-minute segments, where are you in that segment, or whatever you called it, campaign, where are you in that campaign? So at the end of this campaign, you're going to need to switch it off. Even that, imagine how many arguments that just diffuses before they even begin. So those are the kind of things that I think are really important for parents. And I cut you off midway through your top tips. So you've probably got 2 more. And I realise that this conversation is a very long, ongoing conversation. And we've only just scratched the surface today.
Yeah. So my advice, usually to therapists and people that I'm training, are make sure that you visit some of the safety websites, but be aware that some of the safety websites are not as up to date as others. If you work in a school, you can sign up for, my friend Alan McKenzie has a quarterly newsletter that goes out, and it's got the latest research and conversations. I write in it, as well as a number of other e-safety people. And what that's for is to allow school teachers, I do believe that you don't have to be at a school to sign up for it. It's a free newsletter. And in that, there'll be conversations about what the latest trends are, what the research is actually saying out of these big institutes. I usually do something related to cyber trauma. So I've talked about pornography use, I've talked about the viral trends. That seems to be quite a big issue, because people get caught up in their own fear, and then what they do is they share things without thinking about the implications and the consequences of that. And again, understanding what the platforms are and what they do. So for example, children on Snapchat have these things called Snapchat streaks, which means the longer you talk to somebody, so each day you rack up a point. And it's quite important for these young people to have a visual reminder, quite often, of how important one particular friend is to them. But also, if you, let's say, penalise your children and remove that device away from them, not only does that have an impact on this kind of streaks, it means that you're also not engaging with somebody who might send you a message. And that nowadays is considered as a really, really rude interaction. So there's a couple of phrases, like ghosting is when somebody just stops talking to you and never comes back to have the conversation. There's airing, there's lots and lots of phrases like this. So Urban Dictionary is a good place to go to in terms of learning the up-to-date language. But to be ignored has a much bigger impact on young people than it would have done for you or I when we were in the corporeal world as a teenager. Nowadays, it's a very, very important thing. So I normally talk about the WhatsApp blue ticks. If somebody sees your message and does not reply within a standard amount of time, then young people take that as a really offensive issue. And that's what usually causes the argumentative discourse. So it's understanding what each app is and what the latest trends are. So again, lots of the e-safety websites, and there's about 237 of them, to be perfectly honest. There's a lot of them out there. But the big ones, such as Internet Matters, have a lot of up-to-date information on, and they use the 4 internet providers, BBC and Google. So they're supported by large companies. There is Alan's website and magazine that goes out, and one of the top ones is Southwest Grid for Learning.
Brilliant.
So that would be, I would advise people.
Fantastic. And I was also thinking of CEOP as well, in terms of thinking around safeguarding.
Yes, usually CEOP provide a lot of resources for, so a lot of the resources that they have on there can be for schools, for foster carers, and so on and so forth. One of the places I've seen a lot of the research about adoption and foster care has been on Internet Matters. So recently there was a piece of research showing that actually those are the children who are most at risk, which obviously goes in line with attachment styles and trauma. Which was no surprise to me, basically. And there is something about CEOP and the Internet Watch Foundation are usually the places that we go to report material that's either full of child abuse or exploitation, because CEOP is the Child Exploitation Online Protection. So it is more about preventative rather than, what do we do afterwards?
Yeah. And I guess I want to close because I know you need to move on, but I guess I was just thinking there's lots of safety stuff around there. Parents who don't want their children to be in that world and want them to, they might argue, be children for longer, are going to really struggle in life as it is to do that. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, so lots of children, it's quite interesting because of the age rating on a lot of the platforms. What does happen is, so children are actually handed a smartphone at 13 because that's the age that Facebook says you can sign up. So quite often there's no preparation in terms of, okay, in cyberspace you're going to have this happening. What we need to talk about is if somebody sends you an image that you're not comfortable with. I normally go back to, if we can, talking about feelings of safety. So it's conversations around before you get the phone. You've got to have these conversations before you give them the game, before you allow them onto a certain platform. So there's a lot here about parents to do their own research, and it does sound quite, or children's homes, it does sound quite responsibility laden, that actually it's your responsibility to do this. But the schools have a responsibility to teach. They do not have the capacity to add in all of this e-safety work. So at the moment, the PHSE Association is suggesting that it's a twofold attack, if you like, that we look at educating parents and we look at educating staff. That's really difficult because parents do not like the word e-safety. So what we've got to try and do is have communications about what is your children or what is your child doing in life. And that includes this digital environment. And the children can't get away from it because in schools they've got whiteboards, they've got computers, they go around to their friends. So even where parents do try to limit it, it's not as limited as many of them actually think or know. So again, we can protect children, but the only way we can do that is by looking and learning about the environment ourselves. And to be honest, Lisa, we know that not everybody does that, because otherwise children wouldn't be, and I'm going to go slightly critical parent here, they wouldn't be groomed if parents understood what grooming was. And for me, it's all about the early years. We need to go back and have these conversations really, really early, before the children are about 5, and talk to parents then.
Fantastic. You've been amazing. That is such a packed out conversation, and I really, really appreciate you joining me today. And I'll put all your details into the bottom of the box for people. And thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.